We'd like to welcome Cahlan with us today, a former student here in the program, successful in his work. Cahlan, we have some online students, as you can see over here. Wade, we have four of them now online. So Matt is the facilitator, so they may ask questions too, and Matt will be the person that.
Is the camera over here then?
The camera's right here.
I can see from your computer.
So he'll kind of direct it so that you can, so they can see you and you can see them. So without further ado, let's turn the time over to Cahlan Sharp and give him a big hand.
Thank you. As Dr. Graham said, my name is Cahlan. Sorry, it's actually pronounced
Cahlan, sorry.
That's okay. I just had somebody literally, like yesterday, call me Cahlan. It's happened my entire life. It will continue happening for my entire life, so I do not take any offense whatsoever to mispronunciations of my name, especially because it's spelled not at all how you would expect. So I'm here to talk about, I call it a phenomenon, but it's not really a phenomenon. It's kind of an interesting development that's happened in kind of the professional education space. And it's something that's a big part of my life because I am a part of, kind of a part of this movement now. I started a coding boot camp called Dev Mountain here in Provo. Have any of you ever heard of Dev Mountain before? It makes me feel really good. I was hoping there would be just like one person in the back. So it is a coding boot camp, meaning that it's an intensive school where we only teach programming, we only teach web development, teach a few other things as well, like iOS development, but kind of our core program is a web development class. We have a few different types of that class. I'll talk more about that later, just kind of talking about how the classes work and why they're successful, why we think they're successful. But I kind of want to take you a little bit on a journey through how this coding bootcamp thing has come up and why I think it's a very powerful thing. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the things we're learning as we're running these classes and we're teaching these classes. And I think I mentioned in the summary, but I probably have a lot more questions than I do answers. So I really just kind of want to do a little bit of a brain dump and tell you all the things I've been thinking about for the last 2 years. And then you can synthesize those things and incorporate them into your own lives, or come up afterwards and tell me what I should be doing different or something like that. So I'm also a little bit nervous, and that is because I've had a lot of experience teaching, professionals, teaching adults, teaching programming and things like that. But usually I always have the advantage of knowing more about the subject matter than the people that I'm teaching, right? So when I'm teaching programming to beginners, a lot of times they're starting off from ground zero, and I have this high level of confidence, and but I'm sitting here, or standing here rather, talking to a lot of people that are probably a lot more versed and wise and just smarter than I am, especially when it comes to learning sciences and a lot of the research. And I'm not the kind of person that can tell you, oh yeah, because of this person that wrote this paper or this study that was famous in this year, this is why we're doing this and this is why it's successful. You'll probably be able to do that better than I can. So if any of you want to come up afterwards and give me like an annotated bibliography of everything that I just talked about, that would be really, really great. I would appreciate that. I heard, so Paul Graham, I don't know if you've heard of Paul Graham. Paul Graham is a very well-known startup mentor. He runs an incubator, the top incubator for startups in the world, arguably, out of San Francisco. And he once said that, he talks about how he reads a lot and how he kind of, has this voracious appetite for reading, but he oftentimes can't remember a week or 2 weeks ago specifically things that he read and how they impacted him. But he used this metaphor that I think applies to me so well. He said, your brain is kind of like a compiled program that you've lost the source code for. In other words, everything that you learn does shape who you are, and it does shape your attitudes and your values and the approaches you take on life and business and your career. But you may not always be able to remember exactly who said what, or what study influenced your decision. And I hope that that's true with me. So if anything, that'll help you understand where I'm coming from a little bit. Another reason I'm nervous is because these seminars, I felt like during my time here as a graduate student, were some of the most kind of intellectually stimulating and interesting discussions, a lot of really cool presentations. I still remember And so I hope that I can do that justice for you today, and I hope that something that you take from this is memorable and helpful for you in your careers and in your studies. So a little bit about me. I have this kind of interesting dichotomy in my life where I have been involved as an educator for a very long time. I've taught programming classes at Utah Valley University for a couple years, over 2 years. I've taught in multiple settings, programming education, everywhere from like professional conferences to small seminars to intensive workshops, things like that. And so I've always been involved in this idea of teaching and educating. Also, my Master of Science here from IP&T hopefully gives me some level of credibility in terms of being an educator. And then I also worked in a consulting company building e-learning products for around 4 years. So I have this side of me that has always kind of had a foot in the education space. But for the last 10 years of my life, I've made my living as a software engineer, as a programmer. So that's kind of the other side of that the dichotomy. As an undergrad here at BYU, I'll talk more about this in a second, but I was kind of a self-taught engineer. I got really interested in web technologies and just kind of, the more I learned about them, the more I got excited. And I'm the kind of person, I love building things, I love doing things, I love solving problems. So each programming language I've learned has just kind of been a means to an end, right? Like, how do I solve this problem? How do I build this tool? And programming languages, that I've learned have just been a means to that end. I used to be a big person in Flash. I used to be a big Flash developer. Flash is kind of a bad word now in the web development industry. It used to be really cool like 6 years ago, and now it's like you don't want to tell anybody you're a Flash developer. It's just this is kind of how the web development industry is. It's very trendy, moves very quickly. I also worked as a startup engineer or as a software engineer for a couple pretty large corporations. One of which you're probably very familiar with, the Corporation of Presiding Bishop, which is the LDS Church. The other one is K-12. I used to work for Joseph South here in Provo before he rode off into the sunset to DC. That was a lot of fun. But at heart, I'm very much like I like to be in the weeds. I like to be a part of something new. So I've been a part of a lot of startups. And my wife, sitting in the back there, Kim, can attest to my insatiable desire for new and interesting ideas. And so she's joined me and followed me into 6 different startups throughout our lives. Not always, fully on board, supporting, sometimes kicking and screaming, but she's been an immense support, somebody without whom I could never even be close to what I'm doing today, at any level of success. So startups are just kind of my thing. I just really enjoy startups. I enjoy starting businesses and solving problems from the beginning. 2 of those startups include, one of them was a social media startup in San Francisco. I moved to San Francisco for a couple years, joined a venture-funded startup, kind of lived the startup dream for a little while. Well, I guess as much of the dream as you can live as a husband of 4 in Silicon Valley. It's a very different experience if you have a family than if you're just like a single person living.
Father of 4?
Yeah, father of 4.
We're not joking.
Yeah, right. That's another story. The other startup that I was involved with recently, you may have heard in the news, Scan. They're actually a startup out of Provo, Utah. And with the Sony Entertainment hack that happened, one of the Snapchat board members, if you're familiar with Snapchat, one of the board members was also a board member or advisor to Scan, and emails got leaked and it was revealed that Scan was acquired for like $60 million. And if you saw the car that I drove up here in, you would understand that I had no part of that acquisition and had no options invested in any time to give me any kind of return from that. So please don't think that I'm some kind of wealthy entrepreneur that has been very, very successful. So Dev Mountain, this coding bootcamp I'm going to talk to you about today, is really kind of the perfect combination of those 2 parts of my life. So I finally found an opportunity where I can be passionate about technology, passionate about startups, and be involved as an educator and do what I love. I really enjoy seeing those aha moments for students when they grok something. I use the term grok in programming, which means just like really understand, right? Like you really get it. So every time somebody groks something, that these students get something for the first time, there's a very real sense of accomplishment and positive reinforcement there. So to give you an idea about what has happened with coding boot camps, in 2012, the end of 2012, there was less than 3, probably about 1 boot camp in the entire country. It was out of Chicago. It was called Dev Bootcamp. It taught Ruby on Rails in a very intense 12-week format. And the whole point of this program was come, learn about Ruby on Rails, and then go get a job in 12 weeks. And now in the start of 2015, there are at least 75 of these coding boot camps that have popped up all over the country. They're literally, everywhere. Yes?
Are the coding boot camps there for adult learners, or are they?
Yeah, so we'll talk about that. The majority of those people are adult learners. The demographic really varies, and I'll tell you about some interesting situations here in a minute. But most of them are folks that are either have decided not to pursue a 4-year degree, or they have already completed a 4-year degree in a different field of study and have decided for either career reasons or just for resume purposes that they want to learn coding as a part of their skill set. So it's really kind of a mixed mixed demographic, but generally speaking, they're professionals, adults that are coming to learn to code. If we put this in terms of tuition dollars, in 2012, the market could be represented with about $500,000 of tuition money. Now in early 2015, it's estimated upwards of $73 million of tuition revenue that's being kind of pumped into these boot camps. I'm going to show you an infographic that I like. If I can get it to show up here. Let me pull this over. Okay, so they call this the $100 million industry, even though the total tuition dollars on this graph are close to 73. But you'll just kind of see this is a timeline. So as the timeline progresses, you see these dots kind of poking up around the country. They each represent a boot camp. The radius of the circle is a function of how many students the program services, and I think the color of the circle, how dark it is representative of like how many searches they've had for that boot camp or something. So they're trying to represent some sort of popularity with that. This big circle right here is Dev Mountain in the middle, which I'm kind of proud of. So we're basically the biggest boot camp between San Francisco, California, or Seattle area, and Chicago. So pretty much the only place in the Intermountain West that you can go to without going to San Francisco or traveling to Chicago and attend one of these coding boot camps. Let me get this out of the way now. So it's yes.
Just to clarify, are you saying Dead Mountain or Death Mountain?
Dev, as in development.
I was just going to say, that's really a dark name.
That's right. So that would be a real boot camp, right? You stick it out to the very end. So I think it's important for me just kind of to use myself for a quick moment as a case study for why these boot camps are successful and what purpose they serve. So in my education path, when I started out as an undergrad, I was really interested in like pre-medicine and pre-dentistry. So I was doing, the chemistry classes and the biology classes and whatnot. Quickly realized that was not really my forte. That was not an area that I really wanted to spend time in. I wasn't passionate enough in it to really, drive through those difficult classes. Which I then naturally moved from that into the humanities, right? When I went into Portuguese, thought, hey, I know some Portuguese for our mission in Brazil, so I'm going to get my degree in Portuguese, which then very naturally led me to a master's degree in instructional psychology and technology. You can see, very, very easy transition. And then after that, I, became a software engineer. So like very, very, logical path from point A to point B. This is actually representative of a lot of people. You probably know some of them. Maybe you even are some of these people, right? So I found in my undergraduate career that I had a very difficult time making this very pressure decision of what am I going to be when I grow up, right? Like, who am I going to become? What field of study do I choose? Because that's going to affect my family, it's going to affect my kids, it's going to affect my income, my lifestyle, all these different things. I just felt a lot of pressure, right? And I really had no clue what I really enjoyed to do, or had all these questions in my mind. So I pretty much floated around for 2 or 3 years and then figured out, hey, I better just get a bachelor's degree or else I'm not going to be going anywhere. So anyway, you can kind of see how this pinball machine of sorts led me. I enjoyed my master's degree, obviously, but I still came out with a completely different outcome than many students might expect when they go into a degree. And really, if you want to become a software engineer, there are essentially 2 options for you. The first is you need to get a 4-year computer science degree, preferably from some of the top tier universities in the country, like Stanford, Berkeley, IP&T. Just as a side note, the average cost of these programs for a 4-year program is around $200,000. So you would be leaving an undergraduate four-year degree with $200,000 of sunk costs, and then you would be trying to enter the workforce. And the interesting thing about that is there's a lot of criticism with computer science degrees and teaching relevant information that makes students employable today. As in, they do a really great job of teaching principles and theory, but not necessarily a great job of teaching skills that you're going to go out and start using on day one of your job. In fact, I've heard many employers complain and students complain that they get a computer science degree and they show up on the job and they have to take a few months before they can even start shipping code because they have to relearn a new code base or a new language that was not taught at all in their degree. And some of that's obviously expected, but you can see that there's a gap there. There's a problem. The other kind of end of that spectrum, far end of that spectrum, is that you can learn on your own and get really, really good, right? So you just tackle the online resources that are out there. When I started learning to code, there wasn't much. There was like forums, so I would just go on forums and read forums all day. It was a very difficult learning path. There was no learning objectives, no kind of curriculum path. It was just kind of like, what is my problem now? What problem am I having in my code, and how do I fix it? And that's kind of that this back and forth was how I learned. I put an asterisk there because your mileage may vary when you try to learn on your own. It's a very difficult process. So you have kind of these two ends of a spectrum. And of course, a lot of people think the internet is going to save us. The internet is going to give us all the tools we need to learn in a self-paced, completely personalized environment. I'm going to be able to get all the coding skills I need without ever setting foot in a university or in a classroom setting, and I'm going to be set to go. And what I think what has happened in reality is that although a lot of online coding resources are really good and exceptional resources to begin with, they kind of follow a little bit this diagram right here. And if you can't read the text at the bottom, it's okay. But it's essentially 2 steps, right? They give you some fundamentals, and then it's like, whoo, now you are a coder, right? You basically learn the fundamentals of the language. When I try to explain this to our prospective students that ask me about this, I say it's kind of like saying, I'm going to learn French, and so you go buy a French dictionary and you start memorizing words and you start translating phrases, and maybe you even know how to conjugate a few verbs. You can't necessarily call yourself a French speaker until you've gone to France or spoken with natives for a sufficient amount of time to learn all the nuances and the special cases in different languages and things like that. I feel like the online coding education is a little bit like this. You learn the very basics. You understand how to write an if statement or a for loop, but ultimately you still struggle to actually build an application. The difference between writing a for loop and building a web application are very, very different. There's a lot of skills you need to learn in between those two things. So what we miss out with in this online computer science education, there's a lot of things beyond that. One is social interaction, right? There's a lot of benefits with social interaction that you get by learning with peers. You get motivated because you're sitting next to people that are driven and are working hard, and you see those people and you're naturally there's an energy there when you're sitting next to folks that are driven and working hard. You also have, even just in teaching programming, there's some richer learning experiences that you can have in the classroom when you are teaching people to code together. For example, we use this concept of pair programming. Maybe some of you have heard it. But you have two people sit at a computer, and one person is coding and the other person is talking them through the code. So it's kind of like one person's driving and one person is navigating, right? And they switch roles every once in a while, and it's a very effective learning technique for programming. In fact, a lot of companies, when they onboard new engineers, will have them pair program with somebody for an extended time before they're kind of, let out on their own to make changes to the code base. You're also missing mentorship, right? Just because you know how to write an if statement or a for loop doesn't mean that you understand the right way to solve a problem. There are many ways to solve problems in programming. Just like in languages, there are many ways to communicate something. But there's generally a best practice, or there's generally kind of an accepted way to do something. And it's really hard to communicate that through an online environment and what the best way is to solve a particular problem. It's also really difficult in an online environment to have this kind of project or problem-based learning environment. A lot of times I feel like the online resources are sort of like a math textbook, right? You can read an entire math textbook and do all the problems, but you can't necessarily call yourself a mathematician without understanding how all those problems apply to real-world situations and how to solve problems using mathematics, right? So, there's that element of it as well. Also, web development is an entire spectrum of skills and disciplines. It's not just one language, it's not just one practice or technique. It is a lot of techniques, a lot of different practices. And it's really kind of a spectrum of skills that you need to understand. And it's really difficult to put those skills and those techniques in sequence or chronological order. especially when online learning is all about modularity and personalization, and you can pick this course and choose this one from here and there, it's hard to make them all cohesive again and make them kind of build up to a greater whole. I realize that I don't know how much time I need for questions.
I think our clock is not working.
25-1.
So it's 25
So
minutes.
we need to hand it to
10 to, perfect, okay. Okay, so how does the boot camp work then? What do we do that hopefully helps solve this problem? So first of all, we have a pretty rigorous selection process. Because the classes are so rigorous, we really have to be careful about what kind of applicants or what students we let in the front door. Because we don't want them to come and fail and then feel bad about themselves and feel bad about us. That's not good for us, it's not good for them. So we have a pretty rigorous selection process that includes a phone interview. We have them take a code pre-assessment. Even if they've never touched code before, we give them a list of problems that we want them to try to solve using code. So that forces them, if they've never learned code before, to go and start learning, some code on their own, looking at resources, understanding, how the language works, using basic control structures like if statements and for loops, things like that. And that will tell us two things. One will tell us if they have any aptitude prior to entering the class. If they can complete it in an hour, we know, hey, they could show up and be a pretty good student. Or if it takes them a couple weeks but they still complete it, it shows that they have the aptitude to learn the code, right? So either they have the current skill or at least some level of skill, or they have the aptitude to learn it in a fairly short amount of time. And that's important to us because if coding is the type of thing that takes somebody a really long time to understand, and they're not really, they're not really oriented towards that way of logical thinking, we don't have the time to get them up to speed during the 12 weeks itself. We have to kind of take everybody from 20 to 60 miles an hour rather than from 0 to 60 miles an hour, if that makes sense. Everything is based in a cohort. Well, I guess I should cover. We have over 40 hours of pre-course work that we expect students to complete before they set foot in class on day one. So, buzzword, flipped classroom, right? So we're taking all the information that they could be learning, or homework or things like that, and we're all putting it all in the front of the class so that by day one we expect them to have a basic subject matter level of understanding of what they're going to learn in the class. And then we can use that subject level, or that subject matter and build on that.
What format is that work in? Is it on Codecademy? Do you have your own thing?
A lot of it is on Codecademy, Code School, these different sites that I was telling you about earlier. We use those to our advantage, right? They're great resources for learning the basics. So we send the students there to learn some of the basics. We've incorporated some of our own just because, we feel like there's certain areas that we give some pretty good content. But we're not trying to be a content provider in terms of, hey, everybody, this is how you learn code in terms of online resources. So we use what's out there already. So once they get in the class, they're divided into cohorts based on when they enter the school, and then they are divided up into mentor groups. So the mentor to student ratio is about 4 to 6 students per mentor, and the mentors for our full-time class are there all day, every day. So mentors are, I'm going to talk more about this in a second. I'll skip that for right now. So it's a really fast-paced curriculum. We literally take the students from 0 or 20 miles an hour to 60 or 80 miles an hour in 12 weeks. By the end of the class, they should be building fully featured web applications and hosting them somewhere on the internet. We expect them by the end of the class to have portfolios, projects that they can show to employers and prove that they have the skills that it takes to get a job.
When you say 12 weeks, you mean 12 weeks all day?
Yeah.
You mean 12 weeks, 2 hours a day?
Yeah. So with the immersive program that we offer, it's a 9 to 5 structured program, but most of the students are there far past 5 o'clock. A lot of them are there all night long, where they go back to their apartments and study. So the immersive program literally is all day, every day, live, breathe, sleep, code. We have part-time classes as well that are more, it's usually 3 or 4 hours a day. They're in class for 2 to 3 hours, and then they spend another hour to 2 hours per night.
Are those longer than 12 weeks?
Those are still 12 weeks. We just cover less material in 12 weeks. Yeah. So the teachers instruct. They usually spend, anywhere from an hour and a half to 2 hours in class, just kind of leading a discussion, helping the students, guiding them in kind of coding exercises. And then really the mentors take over from there. The instructors are more just kind of, facilitators of discussion and guiding people through principles, introducing principles. And the mentors are really where the learning happens, honestly. The instructors might introduce a concept, they give the students a project to do, and the mentors are there with the students all day, every day, helping with problems, answering questions. Why isn't my code working? They're helping them work through their problems. and getting through the material. So there's large portions of project work. Usually about 2/3 of the day or the class period is taken up with project work. They're spending time in a repository. We use GitHub for our projects, but they're spending 2 to 3 hours in the project, completing the requirements, finishing the code that needs to be finished to deploy the project.
So how much of what they are doing is design work versus development work? Do you understand
Yeah.
what I'm saying? Because, yeah.
Great question. I would say during the class periods themselves, during kind of the curriculum-driven portion of the class, there isn't a lot of design kind of forward thinking. We're kind of giving them, we're giving them we're giving them a learning objective, and we're saying, okay, now use this to solve this problem in this context, right? So we're giving them these little mini projects and larger projects so they can then kind of tackle that problem. During the project portion of the class is usually where there's more design thinking involved. So they sit down in a group or by themselves, and we usually take an entire class period or a couple just to kind of help them map out what their project is going to be and how they're going to solve this problem. Partially because sometimes students try to tackle problems that are way too difficult for their skill level. Like, I really would like to build the next Facebook, in the next 3 weeks. And we're like, I don't know if that's a good idea. Let's try to tackle something much smaller than that. So, just kind of helping them set expectations and helping them understand what their limitations might be, helping them anticipate roadblocks. That's a big part of the project portion.
And this is at a location, is that correct?
Yes.
They come together? Okay.
Yes. So we have a campus in Provo that they all come to. There's also a campus in Salt Lake. Actually, about 60% of our students that come to our Provo location are coming from out of state. So we've got people from all over the country that are flying in, and we actually provide housing. We've rented a bunch of apartments close to our campus. And so it's kind of a live, work, literally an immersive environment it's sort of like an MTC for coding. It's actually a pretty good comparison in my mind. Okay, so just kind of some pedagogy that I want to run through for a second. Some pedagogical principles that I think kind of affect the effectiveness of a coding bootcamp. One is that we try to use really, really modern curriculum. So if traditional four-year computer science degrees err on the side of maybe being a little bit too traditional and maybe archaic, we try to err on the side of being ultra-modern, latest and greatest. We're always teaching people, skills that they should be able to put on a resume or on their LinkedIn profile, right? Like every learning objective we want to match up with something they can put on their profile so that it's going to make them employable. We also, that requires that we're rewriting the curriculum constantly. So I would estimate that about 50% of our curriculum is kind of revamped or rewritten every time we run a cohort, which is about 3 or 4 times a year. So we're constantly rewriting curriculum. We have curriculum writers that at the end of every cohort, they go back through all the curriculum and they take out stuff that either didn't work or that has gotten outdated, and they're putting in new things all the time. It requires a lot of flexibility, right? Because we have to be able to say, okay, this new piece of content that we put in this new lesson plan didn't go as well as we thought. We need to spend another day on it, so we have to kind of adjust the rest of the schedule to fit that piece. So it requires a lot more flexibility and kind of an adaptive nature as opposed to kind of a static curriculum that might stick around with you for a long time. We focus a lot on relevancy. I think I kind of covered this already, but each day the students begin with a coding challenge. So they spend 30 minutes trying to solve a problem with code that's kind of just a small little snippet. And a lot of these coding challenges that we give them are coding challenges that either we have seen or former students have seen in coding interviews that they're going to have when they go get a job. So we're trying to take, from the very first moment of class, we're trying to take a problem they're going to have to solve in an interview, and we're trying to just constantly kind of feed that to them, get their brains awake, get them thinking about things, get them in the right state of mind. We have guest speakers and industry experts invited. One of the things that I really like that we're doing this cohort right now is we're taking a brand new technology, we have a brand new framework that was invented by Facebook, a front-end framework called React.js, and we're going to make a conference out of it. So for a week of the full-time class, we're going to invite anybody around the country that wants to come, and they can come basically participate in class with us for a week. And the students are just going to naturally be a part of that because they're already going to be there learning, but we're going to invite anybody else that wants to come take part in that as well, which is really cool for the students because now they get to network with professionals that are already in the industry around the country, and they're also learning something that is like literally so bleeding edge that you can't learn it almost anywhere else right now. So a lot of focus on relevancy. Also very much hands-on. Hopefully I've communicated that. One of our kind of principles here is that we want to keep students' fingers on the keyboards as much as possible. We don't do a lot of, I'm talking, you're listening, taking notes type of thing. If I'm talking, it's because I have to explain a very difficult concept, but very soon after, I'm either coding, you're following along with me, or I'm giving you something to do and you're trying it, and then we're talking about what worked and didn't work. So we're trying to just keep them coding as much as possible. Also, again, there's not a lot of lecture. It's usually more of kind of, we call it guided practice, where the instructor is talking about something, but they're always talking about it in the context of writing code. So hey, today we're going to write a web server. Here are some libraries that I'm going to use to write this web server, and they're going to talk about the principles as they're coding a web server in front of the students. So they're kind of practicing, they're guiding the students through this process.
Quick question from someone online. Going back to the curriculum development, how you change it often, how do you evaluate which pieces of the curriculum work well and which don't? What needs thrown out, what stays?
Yeah, great question. It's usually, there's kind of a feedback loop between students and mentors, obviously. Since the mentors are so hands-on and present with the students all the time, they're observing very quickly when students are all getting caught up on a particular problem or a project, or they see something that's in the requirements that doesn't make much sense. So our mentors are actually really key, not just in helping the students, but giving us feedback from the students as to what works and what doesn't work. So I would say we rely a lot on the mentors. We just hired a person for this cohort that's happening right now. We call them a student success person. So literally, we'll talk about this in a second, but their job is to make sure all the students are having a good experience, which sounds kind of fluffy, but it is important because these students are going through a very difficult, challenging time in their lives. And there's a lot of psychology that's involved in that. But anyway, so they get feedback as well. So it's kind of a couple different sources, but usually the mentors are the primary source of that, their feedback. And we have a couple of things like mini projects. So the instructor presents a principle. That principle is followed up with kind of a mini project, an isolated, very simplified version of application for that problem or that principle. And then they're set loose on a larger project they usually spend the rest of the time working on. There's also a lot of review that's involved in that as well. So about that psychology, I think this is really fascinating. I've learned so much, well, a lot for me about human behavior and psychology in creating these classes. One is, I don't know if any of you are Malcolm Gladwell fans. He's kind of an interesting, polarizing figure a little bit. But he talks about, in his recent book, David and Goliath, he talks about this principle of relative deprivation, where he talks about that the top 30% of STEM-related degrees, undergraduate degrees at Harvard, the top 30% of those students actually complete their STEM-related degrees, whereas the other 70% drop out or get demotivated or whatever. That ratio is actually the same for kind of the average group of universities around the country. So the interesting thing about that is if you think about it, supposedly the other 70% of those Harvard students should be smarter even than the top 30% of students that are completing STEM-related degrees in other universities, right? But what Malcolm tries to assert is that they're experiencing this thing called relative deprivation, where you might be a really smart person in your high school and you might be really, really good at math, but when you go and you enter the math program at Harvard, suddenly you're surrounded by people that are as smart or smarter than you, and you might start to feel a little bit bad about yourself. You might start getting B's or C's in classes that you never expected to get anything but A's in. And suddenly you start feeling like maybe I'm not cut out for math after all. Whereas if you'd gone to maybe a university that was not kind of the Harvard level, maybe not an Ivy League university, you might still excel in math and become a mathematician, right? So there's kind of this interesting phenomenon where people, when they're surrounded by other talented, smart, driven people, sometimes that kind of is a challenge for them because they're not used to being compared to everybody else. They're used to kind of setting themselves apart. So this creates this really interesting situation.
If it's a competitive learning environment, right?
Correct, yes. I just somehow lost. Let me see where my cursor went. Sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties here. There we go. Okay, so what happens when these students come up against this difficult program? The program is extremely intense, and I'm not joking when I say that. We tell students from day one, you should feel, at times in this class, you should feel overwhelmed. You should feel maybe even like you're not smarter than other people, like you're dumb. These are natural feelings that you're going to experience. And some people, when they come up against challenges like that, they have kind of different coping mechanisms, right? Some students will just give up. They'll say, hey, I'm not cut out for this. This isn't for me. And they will gladly, kind of walk out the door and go pursue a different path in their lives, right? And obviously we don't try to stop those people. If they're convinced they can't do it, then, obviously they can't. Some people will actually get very aggressive and start blaming others for their own failures or their own lack of understanding. They'll start getting really, really critical on the teachers or the curriculum itself because they don't feel like it's customized enough to their learning style to be able to really succeed in the class. It's a really interesting thing. Even when I feel like we've had some of our best teachers, our best curriculum, there's always a student in the class that is never satisfied and is always, at odds with the teacher and doesn't agree with how they're teaching it. Some people literally go through an emotional struggle and get depressed. And it's a very serious thing. We had one student in our cohort that just started here in January that got so stressed before the first day of class. Apparently we set expectations really high. But before the first day of class, well, he showed up to our orientation and actually had been drinking very, very heavily and passed out in the bathroom because he was so stressed out, he didn't know how to cope with it, so he drank an insane amount, ended up in the intensive care unit for 3 days because he had drank so much. Had to have his wife come up from out of town and take care of him. It was really kind of an interesting situation. And I felt really bad for the guy because, obviously people learn how to cope with stress very differently. And hopefully you all here have learned healthy coping mechanisms with stress and don't resort to things like drugs or alcohol. But it happens, especially outside BYU and outside the state of Utah. And we're kind of coming in close contact with that and have to learn how to deal with that. That's one of the things our student success person does, is they try to help people understand how to cope with stress and help them learn and use healthy coping mechanisms rather than resorting to substance abuse or stimulants to keep themselves going. And obviously what we want them to do is work hard, right? We want them to stay positive and work hard. One of the interesting things that I always love to see happen is even some of the best students that come in our class, best in terms of they have prior understanding, they already have a pretty bright future, they're already on a really good trajectory. Some of those students actually get eclipsed by the students that are just really hard workers and really positive people that didn't know anything on day one, right? So sometimes that prior skill, that prior level of knowledge can hinder people because they already think they know a lot and they don't think they need to study. But these students come in that are just really hard workers, really positive, and they just excel. And it's amazing to see where those people get at the end of the class. And I think for many of our students, it's the first time in their lives where they're really, really being challenged academically, right? Like, either they haven't attended a very difficult, four-year university, or they've kind of just coasted through high school and jumped through the hoops they needed to jump through. And this is the first time where they're really being put in the pressure cooker, to have to perform.
Are they being graded, or is the pressure to perform because they're in a group and they need to produce something by the end of it?
Yeah, the pressure is all based on the pace of the class. So in other words, the students start feeling like they can't keep up with the curriculum because it's moving so quickly. And we tell them that some of that is normal. Some of that you're going to feel like you're falling behind, and that's okay. Because, again, if any of you have had a language learning experience in the MTC, you might feel like after week 2 or 3 that you are never going to learn this language. It's never going to fit in your head. And no matter how, it doesn't matter we're learning different verb tenses today. I still don't even understand the basic verb conjugations or whatever. It's a very similar experience, but after week 6 or 7, things start to click and they're able to understand. So that pace is kind of designed to be quick, but it also, we expect everybody to fall behind a little bit. But yeah, a lot of these students, if they're falling further behind, they feel like they're farther behind than all their peers. They start getting really worried, they start getting stressed out, things like that. So what makes us, I think, Dev Mountain and coding bootcamps in general in pedagogy is this highly engaged mentorship model, right? Like we have mentors that are literally on staff all day, every day, helping students. The instructors are there for a little bit, but then they take off, and the mentors are really the ones that are interfacing with the students all day long. This helps us because we don't want students to get stuck on problems for too long, right? If they are stuck on a code problem and they can't get a bug fixed and they're there for 4 hours, that is just, that's the motivation killer, right? They feel like they just feel like they're hitting a brick wall and they can't get through it. So the mentors are there to help them, kind of rescue them when we let them struggle for a little bit, but then after a while we want to make sure they don't get stuck on a problem for too long. Also, the part-time model I mentioned earlier is kind of a unique approach that we have. Even though our immersive program is the most popular and students are coming from all over the country, there are lots of people in the country and in Utah that can't quit a job, move their family to a new state, and spend thousands of dollars on a coding school and not work for 12 weeks, right? So our part-time model is really built for people who are working or going to school and can still take the class and learn the skill kind of on the side. And then, less lectures, more class. Do you have a question?
So I want to go off Dr. Graham's question. So there are no grades at all?
No grades. There's no credentials either. They don't leave the class and say, I got my degree from Dead Mountain. I mean, if they have something, if they need something to show their employer to kind of for tax purposes or whatever, or reimbursement purposes, we'll give them a certificate that I made on Google Docs. But that's about as formal as it gets in terms of credentialing.
So you're not accredited by anybody?
We're not accredited. We're actually working with the state right now to become an approved post-secondary proprietary school. That takes a lot of money and a lot of time. We have to be in business for a year, which is why we just started it. But yeah, there's no credentials, there's no accreditation. That works in the software engineering industry because employers are looking for skills. They're not looking for credentials. And that's one of the kind of the important things about this is employers, yeah, they may look at where you went to school, especially if it was Stanford, MIT, or Berkeley. But ultimately, what can you build? Can you solve my problem? And that's what they want to know if they're going to hire you. So credentials can only get you, so far in the software engineering world. In business, I think what makes us a little bit unique is that we include this housing piece, so people can literally move from anywhere and just kind of dive deep into code. They don't have to worry about what part of town they're going to live in or their apartment rent or those kinds of things. We can kind of eliminate all those other stresses and just let them focus on what's most important for those 12 weeks. It's also affordable. If you look at our full-time program compared to like programs in San Francisco or Chicago, we're generally speaking at least half the price of their programs. So that's one of the great things about doing business in Utah, because you don't have to pay $60 a square foot for space in Provo. You can pay like $12 a square foot for space in Provo. So also the part-time classes. And I think this is a good kind of transition to what you were just talking about with credentials. But one of the reasons why this is working as well is because there's kind of this well-documented skills shortage in the world of the United States in the tech sector, which is, this is from an infographic here, but by 2018 it says there will be nearly 3 times as many job openings requiring computer science knowledge than qualified applicants. So essentially there is always like this explosion of like new companies, new technology, new positions, and there just aren't enough qualified applicants to fill those positions. So companies like in Silicon Valley and in San Francisco it's literally a feeding frenzy over talent. When I lived in San Francisco and I left the job I was at, within 24 hours I had like 3 offers, and I hadn't even advertised to anybody that I had left my current position. Recruiters were emailing me constantly, like multiple times a week, saying, hey, check out this opportunity, check out this opportunity. It kind of feels cool to be that desired, but at the same time, it highlights a problem for San Francisco and the hot tech sectors, which is that they just need more qualified people. They need more engineers. So that's one of the reasons why this works as well.
Cahlan, on the housing slide, do you see that as a particular pedagogical or andragogical benefit in terms of the learning that goes on in the cohorts after hours?
I think we maybe reap some benefits that we don't realize there. Like the fact that you're working with peers and then you go to your apartment and code with peers in your apartment at night is probably a benefit that we don't necessarily plan on, but it just happens. I've never sat down and thought, what is the benefit of the housing? Really, the whole driver for it was let's eliminate the barrier to entry, let's eliminate these worries that they have about housing, and let's give them a place to stay so they can focus on code. So I think, maybe the benefit on, at face value is just that they don't have to worry, like in San Francisco, you don't have to worry about walking, you don't have to worry about walking through a really awful neighborhood to sleep on somebody's floor you're paying $500 a month for, right? You can literally just, go to the place that's already been set aside for you with your roommates and work on code. So, yeah, good question. Another really interesting thing that has happened recently, we had a well-known coder. Do I need to stop? My wife is freezing. Oh, did I miss a question?
I just wanted to know about the youngest people that you allow in your school. So I think you're about to talk about that.
Thank you. There was a very prominent developer in the Utah community that just pulled his daughter out of high school to have her take our class. As you can imagine, the post of this title of his blog post was extremely controversial, and it actually made it to the front page of Hacker News. If you're familiar with Hacker News, it's a kind of a techie software website that just aggregates a lot of information. And it's a very good curation tool for finding good articles. Anyway, it made the front page of Hacker News with lots of negative comments and lots of positive comments. So, for better or worse, he pulled his daughter out of high school because she was interested in web design. He didn't feel confident that the traditional school system could get her the skills that she needed. He's enrolling her in an online high school and is going to have her take the class for 12 weeks. So this is not something we're advertising like, hey, pull your kids out of school and take them to our class. But it is an interesting thing that we've just observed with him and kind of see how it goes. She's doing well in the class so far.
And age doesn't matter then?
Well, I think it does matter. We have piloted some high school students through our programs in the past, and the maturity level has a lot to do with it. Because we're so professionally focused, we can't spend a lot of time inspiring people, like, hey, this is fun, you should pay attention, which I think you have to do sometimes with the younger demographic. We have to just make sure everybody is serious from day one, motivated, driven, and it takes a special kind of person to do that as an adult, much less a 16-year-old, right?
Have you had to eliminate people?
Yes. So, especially in the full-time class, if we feel like somebody is struggling either emotionally or they just can't keep up with the content enough, we try to be as accommodating as possible and saying like, hey, why don't you take the next 2 months off and come back in another couple months and try again, see if you can keep up at that point. If they haven't completed the pre-course work, we also will say, hey, it's probably better if you wait because you're not going to be able to keep up. And sometimes if people just have really rotten attitudes, that can be kind of an infectious thing that, even other students can kind of start playing off of that. And so we try to eliminate those problems before they get too bad. There's a question back there.
So what proportion of your students drop out and what proportion successfully complete their 12-week course?
Good question. I think that the percentage is probably about 10% that drop out. I hope that we're doing enough good work in selecting good people that we can keep those people for the 12 weeks. But I would say about 10 to 15% end up dropping out for various reasons. Sometimes it's because, marital problems. Sometimes it's because, a father passed away. Sometimes it's because they just don't like the content as much as they thought they did. But yeah, probably 10 to 15%.
Passed out badly.
About placement. What's your placement
rate?
rate?
Good question. It's something we're always having to update because it changes every few months. The last time we measured it, we had about 95% placement. So students who, about 95% of students who are looking for jobs were able to get those jobs. Not all students are looking for jobs. Some of them already have jobs, have a job waiting for them or whatever. But yeah, 95% of those students can get jobs. We need to update that statistic again, but we're constantly having to keep it. And on that note, I think outcomes is an important thing. I think this is the reason that I do this ultimately. I've never worked in a business or in a company where my customer has come up to me and said, your product changed my life. Here, I get to experience this all the time. I get students coming up to me after the end of each cohort and they say, I'm so glad I did this. It was the best decision I've ever made. I would never be where I'm at today without your program. Just a couple of anecdotes off the top of my head. One student was doing an online university, was spending $14,000 a year on this online university. Wasn't learning as much as he thought he wanted to. Took our class. During the class, he got laid off from his job, had 2 kids, and was like, what am I going to do? How am I going to finish the class? How am I going to provide for my family? And we, maybe a little bit, we advised him to finish the class, which maybe could have been a really bad decision, but he finished the class and got a job that far exceeded his expectations and was able to really get in a good place in his life. There was another student in a cohort 2 cohorts ago that literally went from working as a part-time worker at Subway to being a full-time software engineer, which for him was like a complete, shift in his life. He was able to improve his life drastically. Another one that I really like is we had a student call me 2 days before a cohort started. He lived in San Francisco because his father's roofing business was failing. His father passed away. He had to move home to run the family business. And then after he sold the business because it was not doing well in the economy, kind of looked at his life and said, okay, I have a wife and a newborn child. I have no skills. I don't have time or the money to go back to school. How am I gonna make this work? So he called 2 days before the class started, drove over, brought his wife and newborn son over from San Francisco the day before class started, and then started on day 1. And then by the end of the class was able to move back and get a job with a well-known tech company in the Bay Area, and is just really happy with his life. So I think those things are really what makes me passionate about doing this and what makes me happy about what we're doing. Seeing people's lives improve, and this is why we're all in education, right? Seeing people's lives improve, seeing people, having opportunities they never would have had without education is a really, really powerful driving force. And ultimately, when it comes to, people ask us, well, you're for profit, how do you justify that? And I think that the only way that you can really make it work is if you have a for-profit side of your business and you have the education side, you ultimately have to have a beating heart. You have to have a soul at the center of your business. If you don't have that soul, if you're all about applicants and revenue and tuition money, then it's ultimately doomed to fail, or at least not, achieve what it can. And I hope, that the beating heart, the soul of our business is what keeps us relevant, it's what keeps us successful, and it's what keeps our students having good outcomes. So I realize we probably already asked a bunch of questions, but are there any other questions before? Did I overstep my
I think
time?
our time is up, but we do have the soup kitchen afterwards where we can ask lots of informal questions to Cahlan. Let's give him a hand. Come up and ask questions. Cahlan can come down and have soup with us and informally chat about these things. Thank you.